A warm welcome to this afternoon's seminar on discovering the secret doctrine. Today we'll learn about Madame Blavatsky's famed book on the very ancient wisdom of the ages, how it was written and by whom, the scientific origins of its teachings, its superb ideas and maxims, and the recommended way to study it. So what is the secret doctrine really? It is not just the book. It is more a system of thought, complete and coherent, of which the book is a part, but not the largest part of it. It is more than an accumulation of knowledge about what we see around us, because science is that. It is a knowledge of nature's laws, the aim of evolution, and the destiny of mankind. It has been known for all time. It was taught to the ancient sages, the Raja Rishis, by those still higher, at the start of certain key periods in the Earth's evolution, and it has been known since then, as it was impressed on the newly forming plastic mind of humanity. And, importantly, that, if recultivated, it can be gradually recovered through study and practice. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna is instructed in this ancient science of Raja Yoga. It says, "This exhaustless doctrine of yoga I formerly taught to Vivaswat." Now Vivaswat was the divine legislator, or the root Manu, who came at the start of the fourth round, and who then communicated it to a long line of spiritual men and women. And it goes on, "Until at length the mighty art was lost, O harasser of thy foes." This is Krishna speaking to Arjuna in chapter 4 of the Gita. So this is really how we understand the idea that the knowledge of these things is the birthright of all of humanity, our birthright. And that is the promise of Madame Blavatsky and William Judge and their teachers, that the seminar aims to shed light on. To open the flower of understanding, in the same way the sunflower turns towards the sunlight, or the lotus bud opens when reaching the surface of the water. The secret doctrine is said to be the cream of the world's philosophies. The highest and best parts of it are in there, in the secret doctrine. This ancient wisdom is needed today. It is important. It is like a light that illuminates the rooms of social and cultural conventions, and illuminates the rooms of individual happiness or despair, either or both of which lead to the inner sacred space of spirituality and knowing. It is said to be the oldest, the safest, and the best way of reaching to that which is apparently unknowable. And the more of us that unite together in that effort, impersonally, fraternally, and without distinctions of which association or theosophical group we are in, so long as we remain true to the original lines and preserve the secret doctrine, then the brighter the light of understanding will shine, and so we will help recover the perennial mighty art of this great ancient wisdom and system of ethics. So for the first talk, let us hear about the history and writing of the book called The Secret Doctrine.
Friends, in this first talk we'd like to provide you with a brief but concise overview of why, when and how the secret doctrine was written, and by whom. It is no ordinary book. To the casual, occasional or uncommitted reader it may easily appear a vast, unintelligible, almost incomprehensible, overly complex mass of virtually meaningless information. In the opinion of serious, sincere, perpetual students of the book, however, no greater book has been written since, and nothing else, not even amongst the best of theosophical books, can compare. We all know that the secret doctrine bears the name of H.P. Blavatsky, but she herself makes it clear right at the start of the preface that she is not really the author, but only the writer. The true authors and inspirers of the book and its contents were the two Indian Mahatmas, or Masters of the Wisdom, most closely connected with the establishment and development of the Theosophical movement, known generally as the Masters K.H. and M., Kuthumi and Maurya. Not ascended masters, not disembodied angelic spirits, not channeled entities, but living, physically incarnated, embodied men, great souls, Eastern adepts, initiated philosophers of the esoteric doctrine, or Gupta Vidya, important members of the Trans-Himalayan Brotherhood, or Lodge, near Tibet. They were behind the book right from the start, and even its title was their choice. Through a combination mainly of telepathic dictation from a distance, showing information via clairvoyant visions in the astral light, and providing pages and pages of their own written notes and text, sometimes through the most unusual means, they worked together in cooperation with HPB, who they knew personally on the physical plane as on inner planes, and who was the only person ever described by them as their direct agent. More than a mere amanuensis, and most definitely no medium or channeler, the inner being of HPB was spoken of by those same masters as a high and initiated chela, or disciple, even as an adept, and as their brother. The Secret Doctrine was published in October 1888. Until then, HPB had written only one book, which was Isis Unveiled, published 11 years earlier in 1877, and which bore the subtitle A Master Key to the Mysteries of Ancient and Modern Science and Theology. Although she had written many articles for theosophical magazines between the appearance of the two books. As was said at the start of the Secret Doctrine, it had originally been the plan of the Masters for that book to be an expanded continuation of Isis Unveiled. The English theosophist A.P. Sinnett had done useful work in drawing public attention to theosophy through his books The Occult World and particularly Esoteric Buddhism, in which he presented and attempted to explain some of the main teachings he'd received in letters from those same masters we've mentioned. But inevitably there were a number of mistakes, inaccuracies, incompleteness, and this led to confusion, misunderstanding, and even misrepresentation of the theosophical philosophy on the part of some of its proponents. In other words, these books weren't enough, and something else, something better, bigger, and more reliable was needed. This was decided as far back as the end of 1883. It was then that HPB wrote these words to Sinnett within a letter. You must know that instead of esoteric doctrine, you have but half a dozen of stray pages, picked at random out of the 6 and 30 volumes of the secret books of QT, that there are gaps between every tenet, none of which is complete, and you have been told by the Mahatmas, in letters you showed us, and told by me many times, that you could not expect to be given that which pertains only to initiation. No lay chela can get it, nor can one understand the thing properly. Even about Devachan, something you have been explained more thoroughly than anything else, you have very vague ideas about it, I see. As fragments of occult science, you have succeeded admirably, and can claim to have given out to the world crumbs of genuine occult doctrines. As a whole, esoteric Buddhism cannot, of course, be considered such, nor have you ever claimed it, as far as I know, to be the alpha and the omega of our doctrine. All this is very sad and perplexing, and now the outcome of it is that I, crippled down and half dead, am to sit up nights again and rewrite the whole of Isis Unveiled, calling it The Secret Doctrine, and making 3, if not 4 volumes out of the original 2. But it was eventually decided by the masters that it would be better for The Secret Doctrine to contain much more of a profoundly esoteric nature, and to deal with matters such as cosmic and human evolution. The initial draft, based on and extensively quoting from and referring to Isis Unveiled, was thereupon discarded, and HPB set to work writing The Secret Doctrine in the form in which we have it today. That is 2 volumes, titled Cosmogenesis and Anthropogenesis. The first deals with the origins, birth, and evolution of the universe, the cosmos, the solar system, and our planet. The second with that of humanity on this planet. Each volume begins with selected stanzas from an ancient Eastern text referred to as the Secret Book of Jian, and is then divided into 3 main sections. The first providing explanatory commentary on the stanzas, the second treating of the subject of the universal language of mystical symbolism, and the third being titled Science and the Secret Doctrine Contrasted. Although HPB affirmed numerous times that she had also completed a 3rd volume and that a 4th volume was also almost ready, these were never published. She had written at the close of Volume 2 that a commencement has been made to fell and uproot the deadly upas trees of superstition, prejudice, and conceited ignorance, so that these 2 volumes should form for the student a fitting prelude for Volumes 3 and 4. Until the rubbish of the ages is cleared away from the minds of the theosophists to whom these volumes are dedicated, it is impossible that the more practical teaching contained in the 3rd volume should be understood. Consequently, it entirely depends upon the reception with which Volumes 1 and 2 will meet at the hands of theosophists and mystics, whether these last 2 volumes will ever be published, though they are almost completed. Their public release was obviously never considered suitable or advisable by HPB and the masters, and so they never appeared. In 1897, 6 years after HPB had passed away, Annie Besant published a book claiming to be the 3rd volume of The Secret Doctrine, but this was a false and misleading claim, as it was nothing of the sort. It consisted primarily of the discarded and abandoned remnants of the initial draft of the first part of The Secret Doctrine. Its contents, at least in that form, were never approved or intended by HPB for publication. I have also noted your thoughts about The Secret Doctrine, wrote the Master Kutumi in a letter to Colonel Olcott, one of the 3 main co-founders of the movement, which suddenly materialized on the table in his cabin while he was on board a ship headed for London during the period that the book was being written. He continued, "Be assured that what she has not annotated from scientific and other works we have given or suggested to her. Every mistake or erroneous notion, corrected and explained by her from the works of other theosophists, was corrected by me or under my instruction. It is a more valuable work than its predecessor, an epitome of occult truths that will make it a source of information and instruction for the earnest student for long years to come." Those last words are significant. An epitome of occult truths, a source of information and instruction for the earnest student for long years to come. The book is not out of date, nor is it likely to be anytime soon. The masters have not produced other books to supplant or supersede it through the agency of later theosophists, regardless of numerous claims and unsubstantiated assertions in that regard. They do not work that way. They say in that book that it will take centuries, plural, before much more is given out. But perhaps it is only the earnest student who can truly appreciate it. Then the German theosophist, Dr. Huber Schleiden, who was sceptical about the secret doctrine being written or inspired by the masters themselves, received a letter from the Master K.H., which included a note from the Master Moria on the other side of the page. The present is simply to satisfy the doctor that the more proof given, the less believed. Let him take my advice and not make these two documents public. It is for his own satisfaction that the undersigned is happy to assure him that the secret doctrine, when ready, will be the triple production of M, Upasaka, and the doctor's most humble servant, K.H. If this can be of any use or help to Dr. Huber Schleiden, though I doubt it, I, the humble undersigned fakir, certify that the secret doctrine is dictated to Upasaka partly by myself and partly by my brother K.H. M. Upasaka is a Buddhist term meaning female disciple, and was a name by which the masters sometimes referred to H.P.B. There's an 1893 article by William Q. Judge titled Authorship of the Secret Doctrine, in which he quotes the message to Huber Schleiden and includes a letter which he had himself received from the Master K.H. on the matter, emphasizing the same things and repeatedly using the word certificate. The secret doctrine is thus the certified work and words of the masters. Although its contents have to be judged ultimately on their own merits and reasonableness or lack thereof, we should still keep in mind what the masters have said about it, and realize that this is no ordinary book, but rather one whose content and format, and sometimes deliberately difficult style, will keep the earnest student well occupied, not just for one lifetime, but for several. There was also a letter sent by the Master Moria to William Judge in either 1892 or early 1893, and which includes the phrase, "as said by me," in SD, again indicating his direct role in the authorship of that book. The Masters' affirmations of their direct role in it thus date from both during and after the lifetime of Helena Blavatsky. Much of the writing of the Secret Doctrine is done by H.P.B. whilst living in seclusion in Europe, after having left Adyar in India, and assisted in her ill health by her friend Countess Wachtmeister. In her book Reminiscences of H.P. Blavatsky and the Secret Doctrine, Wachtmeister relates many of the fascinating and astounding phenomena and occurrences that occurred around and through H.P.B. during this period. The whole book is worth reading and is highly recommended, especially as our time limits don't allow us to refer much to it now. In it, she describes a period when H.P.B. was very ill and on the verge of death. To quote, "When I opened my eyes, the early morning light was stealing in, and a dire apprehension came over me that I had slept, that perhaps H.P.B. had died during my sleep, died whilst I was untrue to my vigil. I turned towards the bed in horror, and there I saw H.P.B. looking at me calmly with her clear grey eyes. As she said, 'Countess, come here.' I flew to her side. 'What has happened, H.P.B.? You look so different from what you did last night.' She replied, 'Yes, Master has been here. He gave me my choice, that I might die and be free if I would, or I might live and finish the secret doctrine. He told me how great would be my sufferings, and what a terrible time I would have before me in England, for I am to go there. But when I thought of those students to whom I shall be permitted to teach a few things, and of the Theosophical Society in general, to which I have already given my heart's blood, I accepted the sacrifice.' In 1925, at great personal expense on the part of some associates of the United Lodge of Theosophists, the original and unaltered Secret Doctrine was republished after having become available and gone out of print just 2 years after H.P.B. had passed away, when it was replaced by Annie Besant with a so-called third and revised edition. The original has remained in print and in demand since 1925, 90 years this year. When it comes to obtaining a copy of the Secret Doctrine, the only entirely unaltered and verbatim editions of the original text published today are those published by Theosophy Company, which is the printing and publishing division of the United Lodge of Theosophists, or ULT, and by Theosophical University Press. And now, in our second talk of the afternoon, we'll hear about the three fundamental propositions which are at the root and basis of not only the book titled The Secret Doctrine, but of the Secret Doctrine itself. Thank you.
So friends, in this second talk, as we heard, we will try our best to share some of our understanding of the three fundamental propositions, which, as was said in the first talk, forms the root, the base on which the whole of the Secret Doctrine lies. And it was written that it is for a good, proper study and understanding of the Secret Doctrine, it is necessary to study and have assimilated these three fundamental propositions. And these can be found either in the Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, pages 13 to 17, or they can also be found in this little pamphlets that we sell for 50p, so really cheap, or you can download them online from our website. And these few pages really contain the essence of the fundamental teachings of Theosophy. And these teachings cannot be understood in one or two readings. They are the work of years and years of reflection, study, meditation. So, as we understand, we're not going to be able to give much in the next 10 minutes or so. But hopefully, if we've given everyone the will to go and study for themselves and meditate and contemplate on these, then we'll have achieved something. So, as we said, in these fundamentals, these three fundamentals, are answered some of the most important, basic, fundamental questions that human beings ask themselves, such as, where do we come from? What is our relationship with other beings and with nature? What is God or deity, depending on how you want to call it? What are the laws that govern this universe? What is man? Who are we, in essence? And what is our destiny? So as we said, these three fundamentals, or fundamental propositions, they are realities on which we have to reflect. They are postulates which we are asked to examine and compare with our experiences, with our own experiences of our own lives, check them for consistency, for coherence, logic, justice, universality. These three fundamentals, as we have said, have to be assimilated and kept in mind at all times for a study of the Secret Doctrine to be of any benefit. And Theosophy, in the best tradition of the ancient wisdom, proceeds from the universals to the particulars. So we'll start with the first fundamental, which postulates an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle on which we can't say much because it transcends our power of conception and without the risk of limiting the limitless. What we can say is an absolute reality which antecedes all manifested or conditioned being. In other words, an infinite and eternal cause, the rootless root of all that is, that was, and will ever be. Without any attributes or relation to the manifested and finite universe, and finite being, and it's rather beingness than being. In Sanskrit, it can be translated as sat, and it's both absolute being and non-being. And it can be symbolized in two aspects: absolute abstract space and absolute abstract motion, or unconditioned consciousness, or the great breath. This absolute or parabrahm is out of all relation with conditioned existence, we've heard. But once it emanates, then appears duality in spirit or consciousness and matter. And this duality, these two aspects, consciousness or spirit and matter, are but two aspects or facets or the one reality, the absolute. But in the manifested universe, because consciousness needs a vehicle of matter to focus a ray of the universal mind. And this is to allow individual consciousness to well up as I am I. So what we call self-consciousness at a certain stage of evolution. So there is one reality which has a dual aspect in the conditioned existence. The second fundamental proposition is the universality of the law of periodicity. So flux and reflux, ebb and flow, which is also called the law of cycles. So we can see it in our daily lives. Nothing in the universe escapes from this universal law. Day and night, life and death, sleeping and waking. They're all succession of relative starts and relative ends. Endless successions of smaller cycles within bigger cycles. An alternation of active and latent phases. The universe is the periodical manifestation of the unknown absolute essence, worked and guided from within outwards. And reincarnation is an aspect of this second fundamental applied to man. Now, moving on to the third fundamental proposition, it affirms that all in the universe is conscious. Nothing is devoid of consciousness. Even if we can't perceive it, for example, in the mineral kingdom. And we have in this third fundamental the key idea of the monad, or the spark of the one sun, and the fundamental identity of all souls with the universal oversoul, which is a ray, or we can take the image of the rays of the one sun, and each of these ray is never separate from the sun. And in the same way, the monads are not separate from the one central spiritual sun. And each spark or monad passes through every form of the manifestation, gradually acquires individuality. At the start of this process of involution, by a natural or instinctive impulse, up to the stage of man, when from that stage the process of evolution becomes self-induced and self-devised, where man has to use his own efforts and his own will to direct his evolution, readjusted by karmic law, which is also the law of our inner being, as being the law that rules the universe, but it rules both, because there's no separateness, there's a unity, a oneness between us and the universe. And the monad then ascends from that stage through all degrees of intelligence, through all the kingdoms in succession, mineral, plant, animal, through the stage of man, and then the next stage, the Dhyan Shohan, or the divine or perfected man, which is the next stage onwards, back to the unity. And we can say that in man there is a triple line of evolution: monadic or spiritual, intellectual, and physical. And man is the union of these three lines, but more will be said in the fourth talk on this subject. To sum up, the first fundamental is the principle of the unity of life, undivided and indivisible. The second fundamental proposition is its manifestation, so the manifestation of this principle, which happens in a cyclic manner. And the third fundamental proposition is the identity of nature between the one life and the universe and man. In his innermost nature, man is the absolute. HPB says in The Secret Doctrine, on page 247, the monad, or jiva, per se, cannot be even called spirit. It is a ray, a breath of the absolute, or the absoluteness rather. And also, on page 135, first volume, at the threshold of paranirvana, the monad reassumes its primeval essence and becomes the absolute once more. So we've heard what these three fundamentals are, but why are they so important? And this is because they give a metaphysical or true basis of our relationship. So the relationship of man and the universe, of the microcosm and the macrocosm, of which we'll hear a bit more in the third and fourth talk as well, and the fundamental identity of all with the one self. And if, as Gandhi said, we want to be the change we want to see in the world, change has to operate from within without. The outer is a reflection of the inner, and the duality in the manifested world has to eventually be transcended to the plane of unity. And we would like to finish with the idea of universal brotherhood, which, if you know the the first objects of the Theosophical Society, this is the formation of a nucleus of that universal brotherhood. And these three fundamental propositions give a metaphysical basis for why this universal brotherhood is not an ideal but a fact and a law in nature. And we will go as far as saying, although it might sound paradoxical to some, because of the separative view which is now prevalent in this society, but metaphysics can be highly practical because all aspects of life are connected, and it holds a key role in guiding our realization of the self or of unity, of the unity of life. So this is all we have time for. So I hope we will go and study these three fundamentals.
Friends, thanks for all your questions, including the ones that have given them through via Skype. We have quite a few here, and we'll try to give short answers, if possible, from the panel. So there are a few questions on the historical part. A few on what the third volume is and how did it come about. Why did Annie Besant publish the discarded initial draft? And another question that also is on the same topic, where are they, or can they be found somewhere, the third and the fourth volume? Can something be repeated or maybe clarified on that part?
Yes. Well, to understand the history of the Theosophical movement, when we attempt to look into the history, we find that within just a couple of years after H.P. Blavatsky had passed away, discord and conflicts began in the original Theosophical Society. Annie Besant, who was a prominent figure and later became the president of the society, began to turn against and start criticising, rejecting, depreciating and so on the work and the writings of HPB. She was joined in that by Colonel Alcott, A.P. Sinnott and others, mainly under the instigation of G.M. Chakravarti, who was a Hindu Orthodox Brahmin who gained a prominent place in the society. And so within just a few years it had been decided that now the Theosophical Society would teach something different, so the Besant version of Theosophy. And she wanted to get rid of and do away with anything left over from HPB. And so these leftover and discarded documents, half-finished articles and so on, she put together, published them in what was called the third volume. But almost immediately, other theosophists who knew better began protesting, criticising this, and pointing out that it was not what it claimed to be. And as for the original third and fourth volumes that HPB herself had written and spoken of, we can assume they must be somewhere, but whoever has them or whoever knows isn't saying. Although as late as 1895, 4 years after HPB had passed away, William Judge wrote an article in which he mentioned certain things as being in the manuscript of the third volume. So some theosophists have the idea that perhaps when William Judge went from America to London after HPB's death to help sort things out, perhaps he had taken away the third and fourth volume manuscripts for safekeeping. But that's only a hypothesis. We don't really know.
Maybe add that, well, I think in the view of some of the students here, it's probably not recommended to, it's down to everyone's own individual choice whether they want or not to go and have a look at that and make their own mind, their own opinion. But we don't recommend studying that, obviously, because there is enough in these volumes that we have here, the first and second volume. There is enough for lifetimes of study and work and assimilation, The reason why we haven't got the third and fourth volume is because we're not ready for it. So maybe we should focus on trying to assimilate what we already have, and just be patient, because when the time will be ripe, more will come.
It's also said that there's no way of knowing in that so-called third volume how much of it has been tampered with or altered with or edited by Annie Besant. Because a few years previously she'd published volumes 1 and 2 in a so-called revised edition, which was found to have at least 20,000 alterations from the original. Most of them were minor alterations of grammar, spelling, punctuation, but there were also entire deletion of paragraphs and additions and so on. So it's better to stick with what we know to actually have been written by HPB in the form it was written in.
Another question from a person on Skype. Which book is best to begin studying HPB? This person says that he or she started reading ISIS Unveiled, and the question is, shall I switch over to the Secret Doctrine?
Well, different people, when they encounter Theosophy, are at differing levels of experience of how much of these types of concepts or principles they may have already read. So we can't really say there's one definite book which everyone should read to begin with. Some people find it easier and more useful to begin with books of William Judge, who was HPB's co-founder. We sometimes recommend to people The Ocean of Theosophy by William Judge, or his small booklets Echoes from the Orient and An Epitome of Theosophy. Others find they can get on well by starting with The Key to Theosophy by HPB. I've never personally heard of anyone suggesting starting with Isis Unveiled or The Secret Doctrine, because they're both very extensive, complex books. It's better perhaps to start with something simpler and more explanatory, like The Key to Theosophy or William Judge's ones, and then go on to the others.
Maybe we can say also that the Secret Doctrine isn't necessarily one for reading from back to front to back in one continuous flow, but it's more one where you can study and reflect on parts and study themes and look up references on a particular theme in different places in the book and approach it this way, rather than like any other book that you would read from the first page right down to the last. So different ways of approaching it.
Another question, thank you. How can one apply the theoretical metaphysics of the Secret Doctrine in order to experience the hidden laws of nature in our own lives? How can, would you like us to repeat?
Yeah, maybe just to...
How can one apply the theoretical, within quotation mark, metaphysics, so theoretical metaphysics of the Secret Doctrine in order to experience the hidden laws of nature in our own lives?
So, yes, that's a very good question. And I guess it's down to everyone to find the own answer that's and make their own experiences and test it. But obviously, by reading things like the fundamentals, which we heard in the second talk, you can think of implications it might have on the way you see life, certain beliefs that one might have, certain habits that we have had in the past from our birth and our childhood that we've sort of subconsciously taken because others have taken them on. All of these we have to start the work of the work of real philosophy, which is questioning everything, all of our beliefs and all of our habits and thoughts, and and asking ourselves whether they're consistent and coherent with what we've understood about life, and what we now know about the truths, about the laws of nature, about the laws of our own being, and are we aligned, and try and gradually sort of make changes in our own lives, and see whether we can see these. If, for example, the law of cycles, is it that universal? Is it really? And we have to try and internalize some of these, and these are just a few elements, but maybe there are some complementary.
No, not sufficient.
Okay, here's another interesting question from a friend on through Skype. The secret doctrine is about the formation and evolution of the universe and human races, so it can be considered a book quite historic in a sense. But if we hear about chakras in the teaching of yoga, which can we consider more anatomical or psychological? As far as I know, HPB doesn't speak so much of chakras. Why is it so? Is this right? Is it right to say this? And why is it so?
Is it right to say what?
Am I right? What the person has just said, that we're speaking of the anthropogenesis, the formation of the universe, human races, and so it's more like a description of the human races and more historical. And if we look about other teachings, then we see that there is a lot on teachings of yoga on chakras, about the anatomy of man and his psychological nature. And HPB doesn't speak about chakras, and why is it so? Is it, am I right, asks the questioner, and why is it so?
Well, there's the emphasis on chakras in popular modern-day spirituality, which is chiefly in the New Age movement, is entirely misplaced. The New Age view is they promulgate the idea that chakras are so important and that all Eastern spirituality and ancient Hinduism and Buddhism place such a great emphasis on chakras, but they don't. One can read the key main scriptures of Hinduism, for example, for a whole lifetime. The Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Puranas never find any mention of or emphasis on chakras. In Hinduism and Buddhism, chakras are part of the tantric teachings of those two religions. Now, that's not to say that chakras don't exist. Theosophy doesn't deny the chakras, but it denies that they're of tremendous importance or value, or that we need to be focusing on them or doing something with them. But Theosophy is practical in talking about our mental nature, the soul, and so on, which are far more the real part of our being than these chakras. I don't know if that helps to answer it.
Yes?
Maybe there's a reason. It's quite maybe an esoteric part of the teachings as well, and what's been given in the ESD and in the rest of the teachings is only that part that is allowed at that time, given the wisdom or lack of wisdom of our current race. So there's probably a reason why it's not mentioned so much in the teachings.
Yes, the fact of the purity of the inner nature, and also the impact of occultism. There are articles under in the book called Raja Yoga and Occultism, or even conversations on occultism, where HBB, Judge, and other teachers emphasize on the dangers and impacts that could be, unwillingly, could we say, activated through the concentration on chakras, etc., if one's nature is not pure and one's motivations are not pure. But
we should perhaps also briefly mention that the term yoga is a very generic term. It literally means union with the divine. But there are many forms of yoga, and what people commonly think of nowadays in the West when they hear the word yoga is physical, stretching, postures, positions, maybe sitting in meditation and trying to control the breath or awaken kundalini. The Secret Doctrine itself actually speaks of that as the lowest form of yoga. Hatha yoga is the lower yoga. There's Raja yoga, Jnana yoga, Karma yoga, Bhakti yoga. These are the things the Bhagavad Gita and ancient Eastern philosophy deals with the most and promotes, not the physical side, which, as was said, is we're encouraged to leave well alone.
Thank you. Here's a question, probably following the introductory talk, the introduction. Was the mighty power or art part of the human nature in the past? How was it lost? Maybe it will be spoken of in the fourth talk, but it's, if there's some quick ideas.
I think it was said in the introduction that it was impressed on the mind at the start of the cycle, and it still is present somewhere in our inner being, but we somehow have lost the ability to consciously access this knowledge. And part of the teaching of Theosophy is this whole work of reminding us of the immortal nature of the soul, the existence of the Atma, of the Self, and the work we have to do to discipline our lower nature and purify our desires so as to let the light and the knowledge and the wisdom of that higher part of us shine through our waking consciousness. So that's part of the work we have to do in our daily lives.
Maybe time for just one question?
Yes,
with a quick...
You just mentioned the word shine through, yes? Now, and you mentioned how we can get higher up the scale on a spiritual portion. But the way to shine is that, you shine a light, there's darkness, you can't see, you don't know where you're going. You shine a light and it shows you the path, so you're safe to the religion. I believe personally that one of the ways to follow the path is of truth, because truth is like a torch or a bulb or a light. Follow the path, it gives you the wisdom and it shows you the way. So for me, that's one of the ways that you can shine that light to know where
What
you're
is
going,
the question?
and you can go ahead and make more progress.
Thank you. The idea of truth is in fact important, and then it comes, of course, boils down to what is the definition of truth, how do we see it, but as a very inspirational idea, it's the truth is sat, and from that point of view, probably we all agree. So maybe we have to move over to... Yes?
The question on the language of the Secret Doctrine, it was mentioned the almost deliberate, difficult and convoluted language it was written in, and as compared to the Isis Unveiled and even certainly the writings of Judge. Why was that deliberate? Why was it not made easier to understand, for example, simpler language, perhaps clearer language, more direct language?
A quick
answer. Okay.
Yeah?
HPB says in the introduction to the Secret Doctrine, this work is written for the benefit of students of occultism. So although it's publicly available for anyone to read, she says there and later, it's not written for the general public, this book specifically. It's for those who are serious about studying esoteric philosophy and developing themselves on the esoteric level. And so, as B.P. Wadia explains in Studies in the Secret Doctrine, this is a book written so that those who study it have to apply a deeper, higher level of the mind and thinking, and really put their mind and intellect to work in such a way that eventually the manas, or mind, merges with the buddhi, or the intuitive, or faculty of intuition. And through really focusing, trying to work out, trying to understand what's being said, pulling together the different facts and statements for ourselves, and assembling it and doing that effort, then we gain real knowledge. Nowadays it's very popular for esoteric books to have long lists, easy diagrams, where people just read and memorize what they read. But that isn't real knowledge, that's memorization or belief. The aim of the Secret Doctrine in HPB is to make us learn and discover for ourselves what the teachings are.
Thank you. We have questions left, but probably these will be covered through the other thoughts, and we'll be able to come back to these questions if necessary with the other panel.
So, friends, first came cosmogenesis, and then came anthropogenesis. First, the heavens and the earth had to be emanated, constructed, in order for evolution to take place. And it said, the universe exists solely for the evolution of the soul. That all must pass to the human stage of the crucial midway point of soul evolution. The crucial midway point between the lower and the higher kingdoms. And there is a Kabbalistic maxim which goes, a stone becomes a plant becomes an animal becomes a man, the man becomes a spirit, and the spirit becomes a god. So in a nutshell, we have here the whole course of evolution from the lower kingdoms to the highest. Man is both animal and divine in one being. And they meet in the middle, and in the manas, what we call manas principle, the fifth principle, which is the mind, the principle of the mind, the faculty of thinking, of reason. The animals have instinct, man has instinct plus reason. So the course of evolution, we could say, began after the cosmogenesis, which is symbolically expressed in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, built by the builders, the Elohim, who constructed the angelic hierarchies, who built or who emanated the universe according to the Logos, the divine plan. First came the elemental kingdom, then the mineral kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and then man. And it said that all are either incipient or perfected men. Incipient means latent, potentially, or perfected men as the angelic hierarchies, or the Dhyani Chohans. Human evolution proceeds through 7 root races and 49 sub-races. Each root race has 7 sub-races. A root race corresponds to a world epoch and civilization. For example, the Atlantean epoch was known as the fourth root race, but it comprised 7 sub-races. The Atlantic epoch lasted several million years. So obviously each sub-race embodied a new civilization, a different aspect, a dominance of a particular sub-race. and for example, the last sub-race before the flood was known as the Mongolians, from which the Chinese, Eskimos, and American Indian races are descended. The cyclic rise and fall of continents, planetary and climate change is linked with the evolution of new races, species, and civilizations. We are now in the fifth sub-race of the fifth root race, known as the Aryan. This is the post-Diluvian world epoch or culture. We are the fifth root sub-race, known as the European. There have been 4 since the flood, or the first sub-race being the Indian. And it said that eventually all will become adepts when the Manas principle is fully developed by the 7th root race, which will be many hundreds of thousands of years from now. It said the seed of the 6th sub-race is being planted in America, in the American continent, and is being gradually will evolve from the mixture of all the different races and cultures who have settled there. And we could say that not only each root race, but each sub-race develops a different quality or aspect of human nature, expresses that, whether it be intellectual or physical strength, psychic powers, or whatever. And yes, we could say that all are either incipient or perfected men. Now this applies universally to all races who have reached the halfway human stage, whatever form physically, whether humanoid or otherwise. It said that man is spread, or humanity is spread throughout the cosmos, not just on this one tiny planet on the edge of the galaxy. Life is spread throughout the universe in one form or another, at different levels of intelligence and evolution. But the experiment of humanity takes place throughout the cosmos. Not much could be said in the 19th century on this point, but it is alluded to in a few places that there are myriad Earths in the cosmos. In the early races, man was still ethereal, non-physical, as was the Earth itself. So, in the first 3.5, well, we are in the 4th globe now of the chain of 7. The early globes and races were ethereal, and until we reach the middle of the 4th root race, the Atlantean root race, when the Earth and the man himself reached his period of the most densest physicality. Men and animals in those early races were gigantic, were as alluded to in all the mythologies regarding the Titans and the giants. The fifth root race of smaller stature, and that seemed to be the trend for the future races as well. We speak of the first race as being protoplasmic, almost formless, ethereal, almost said the original shape of man was actually globular or circular. And later on, the Hyperboreans, and then the third root race were known as the Lemurian. By that stage, they had evolved into the mindless gigantic apes, And at a certain point, when they reached a level of we could say, physical and psychic sophistication, the principle of self-consciousness, the power of thinking, of reasoning, the manas principle was awakened in them. This happened in the fifth sub-race of the third root race. How was this achieved? This was achieved through the descent of the Manasaputras, or the incarnation of the sons of the universal mind, from higher planes through the operation of karmic law into the nascent animal or human forms. Now this corresponds to the biblical legend of the fall, of the fallen angels who supposedly rebelled against God and were cast out of heaven. And we could also say that prior to the lighting of the manas, another crucial evolutionary stage was reached. This was the splitting of the sexes into two sexes. Prior to that, the protean human races, as was the first Adam, was just one sex, or the hermaphrodite. They reproduce themselves through different processes. For example, budding was one, sweat-born was another, egg-born was another. But this was followed on because this was the animal form of reproduction, and as symbolized by the allegory of Eve being created from Adam's rib. So the one sex split into two, and the form of reproduction became the animal reproduction as we know today. So the sons of the universal mind, or the gods, beheld the daughters of men and found them comely, and they took wives among them. So again, in allegorical form, this was the descent of the Manasaputras, or the fallen angels, into the animal men of that epoch. A descent, we say, not a fall, necessary to further human evolution on this planet. We could say it's also alluded to by the allegory of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. When they ate of the forbidden fruit, they became self-conscious. They became aware they were naked, and they became afraid. There are different ways to interpret that allegory, apart from the very negative one of which Christianity does. It was a necessary stage in evolution. And the Adam and Eve of that time were, we could say, the early human race, or they symbolize the early human race who lived in Eden, which was a higher astral plane, not a place on the earth, as literally. So from the midway through the fourth race, humanity is gradually growing again more and more ethereal. It was said earlier that three lines of evolution meet in man: the monadic, the monasic, and the atmic. The monadic, or the spirit spark, which is the impulse for evolution, drives the force of evolution through the lower planes, through lower kingdoms, from the mineral up to man, from which point we have the monasic stream, the lighting up of the manas, or the power of the mind, and we have the atmic, which is a ray of the universal spirit latent in man himself, which when we reunite with, or we join with, as in symbolizing yoga and union with the divine, then we become one with the divine again. We return to our source. So it's the downward arc. We heard about the downward arc of involution from first globe down to the fourth, or the most ethereal plane down to the most physical, and then the upward arc, man becomes a man, and not just man, but the earth itself, more and more, gradually more and more ethereal on the journey back to the spiritual ideal, or the spiritual man, the cosmic man, the true man, in fact. We should remember we are those fallen angels, although we have largely forgotten it. From now on, as was said, now that man has free will within certain parameters, he has the thinking principle, he can accelerate or slow down his own evolution through self-devised means and efforts by his own actions. So the rest is up to us.
So now we move on, and we have the second part, which covers cosmogenesis, the birth of the universe, and then with the first talk, and then, the third talk, and then we'll have a fourth talk on anthropogenesis, on man's origin, and then we'll have, as was said, time for formulating questions, and then the panel will take over. It's quite a challenge, actually, to try to cover cosmogenesis in about 12 minutes. We'll not go into, obviously, the details of all that is in the book, but just to give you a feel of the way the three fundamental propositions, as was said, cover the idea of some, a truth, a reality, and then the appearance of the universe. Now, when we look at the cosmogenesis, one of the things that really strike us as being a key idea is that nature is built with intelligence and with a method, this methodology. And so when we look at it, we see that the scientists today are coming to that conclusion, and there's a lot of observation, but from the physical part and going deeper, inner, into all the intricacies of the laws of whether in biology, in astrology, or the scientists are all with instruments trying to observe this and trying to figure out what's the law behind. But when we look at it from the point of view of this philosophy, the Secret Doctrine points out that there is a very organized way of a kind of deployment, that is the emanation we heard of in the fundamental propositions. And this means that there's not one God that has decided just like that to create a universe which will be separate from him, but this principle is underlying every the whole manifestation and what is beyond manifestation, obviously, because the reality is something that cannot be changed. But when it comes to the life of the universe, we have something that is very metaphysical as the logos, and there are hierarchies which carry these plans from the universal mind, which lies in a latent position during the cycle of rest, and then when the awakening or emanation time comes, then there is this awakening, but all takes place with the help and under the responsibility of different hierarchies. So when we look at this, we may think that these are, forces, and so we have many gods Is it a pantheistic vision? But if we have this underlying idea of what hierarchies are, or hosts, then it's very interesting to see that these hierarchies partake of the universe and of man. So we see that the macrocosm and the microcosm are very, very closely linked. And this means that man is part of this universe, including the kingdoms, and so there is this unity. And so we'll see that respect and understanding of the universe are part of the logical consequences of a reality. And the hierarchy, what does it mean? It means that, for instance, we picked up a few sentences, hierarchies of spiritual beings through which the universal mind comes into action is like an army, it is said, or a host, each containing a larger individuality to which his own interests are subservient, and each containing lesser individualities in itself. So we see that there is a logical compromise, a logical organization, and a logical cooperation. And this we see for those who go into medicine and who observe diseases and who observe the way the body works. It's exactly this. A logos, or a collective creator, is of the universe, demiurgos, an architect, while furnishing the plan, leaves the manual labor to the masons. The plan is furnished by the ideation, which comes from the previous wisdom and previous work and previous universes. And then the constructive labor led to the hosts of intelligent powers of the universe. But it's no personal deity, it is said. So what could we say about this? HPB says all are entitled to grateful reverence of humanity. However, a man ought to be ever striving to help divine evolution of ideas and not to consider these as personal deity. And he must be striving as best as he can to be a co-worker of this cyclic task by observation, as was suggested during the panel. So there is a very close correlation between the planets and the way the universe is built, the way the Earth has been, let's say, materialized from something that is very, very homogeneous to something that is apparently very material and heterogeneous. But there is a very logical way of deployment, and there's a diagram on page 200 which shows different globes in the descending arc of how the spirit and matter work together from plane to plane, and then how after this, at the bottom of the arc, there is a reascending of this experience with knowledge and progress gained. These are just we're just sort of pointing out to some key ideas. So with this in mind, we'll go to another key idea. So we had the first one, which was nature is built with intelligence and methodology. And then the idea of evolution and progress, of which we've already spoken, but it's very interesting to see that everything, whether it be man or atoms, HPB says the SD teaches the progressive development of everything, worlds as well as atoms. So when we look at this, we have a very different way of looking at the other kingdoms, whether it be, what we could imagine as superior to man or what is inferior. And we can see that there is this chain of progressive awakenings. And everything is in this chain of awakening. The whole order of nature evinces a progressive march towards a higher life. So this gives a very strong basis for optimism. Not utopia, but something that is really optimistic. with patience. And so we heard that man was the result of 3 lines of evolution, but it's not just man, it's also the whole of the universe, all the different kingdoms. We can call them kingdoms like the mineral kingdom or the elemental kingdom or the animal kingdom, the vegetable kingdom. There is intelligence, there is life, there is force, there's something that pushes everything towards something like the symbol of the lotus, as HBB says. It's the pattern and the promise of the lotus is contained in the seed. The seed is buried in the mud, and then the stem comes out, and there is something that is progressive, but it cannot be stopped. It shoots through the muddy waters, and then it comes up to the clear air, and then the flower blossoms. And this is a very strong symbol called Padma, or the lotus bearer, and that's one of the reasons why it's also used in symbols. There's another idea. We spoke of intuition. We think that it's only for man, but there's something that is very interesting. It's that if we think of the states of consciousness, there's something that is correlative between the universe and man. And buddhi, or the intelligence, which is intuitive, and this intuition gives one of the characteristics of buddhi is ubiquity, which means there's no limit. And that's one of the reasons why man can understand the universe, and the universe can also be an ally with man. We spoke of states of consciousness, this idea of going from something that is homogeneous to something that is heterogeneous, and then going back with the experience and wisdom gained through this experience, gives to man, as well as the rest of the universe, the understanding that the physical plane is just one aspect of life, but there is something that is much more complex, whether it's psychology, whether it's intellect, whether it's emotions and spirituality. All these are part of states of consciousness that connect man to insects, animals, and other beings, because that is how the instinct of animals can understand. They have the sixth sense, for instance, and all this can be explained because of states of consciousness and the perception of what is there. But we all carry these senses within ourselves. So man is a very complex being, very sophisticated, just as the rest of the universe. So this also gives us the idea of unity, but we need to let our friend take over and speak of anthropogenesis.
Okay, friends, so thank you for all those questions. We've got probably more than we can get through. And because we've got a lot, we'll just ask one speaker to give their thoughts on each one. So let's start with something. Can something be said about the differentiation of the sexes that was mentioned in the fourth report?
The splitting of the sexes. Well, as said previously, the first human races up to the middle of the third were hermaphrodite. They had different forms of reproduction, which are described in the Secret Doctrine. What we call animal reproduction, the animals had already divided into two sexes, and then before man, and then prior to the lighting up of the manas, the nascent or early human races split into the two sexes that we know now, which is imitating really the animal reproduction. As I said, this was symbolized by the story of Adam's rib in Genesis, where, remember, the first Adam was one sex, or two sexes in one. Then God decreed, he believed Adam to be lonely, he needed a helpmate. He took a rib, and from the rib he made Eve. So in symbolic, in allegorical form, we have the splitting of the one sex into two. And yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And also there's
Sorry,
the
can
fact...
I just ask, why did he have to make a female for Adam? I mean, if he wanted a companion, could it as well been a male, or a dog, or a horse, or something like that? Why did it have to be a...
Well, that's a good question. Male and female are really only...
Or it could be a child, you know?
It's a symbolic thing. No. You have to take it symbolically. You see, it's a positive and the negative.
The two polarities.
The two polarities.
And you cannot reproduce without the two polarities. Positive and the two males cannot reproduce, or two females. And that's against nature. It's impossible. I mean, and likewise...
Yeah, just a point that this is just the mode of reproduction, but as far as the soul is concerned, maybe you could say, there's no such thing as sex. It's a spark. It's a spiritual spark, and we go through into the body of a female or male or whatever the experiences are, and then as we rise in along the arc, then as was said, the experiences vary and the mode of reproduction also. That was what was said in the talk.
Ultimately, to reach the state of the divine androgyne, male and female in one, consciously, we have to resolve or balance the two polarities in man. So, the female is to develop the male aspect. The male, needs to develop the female aspect in himself. So, actually, the saying "man, know thyself," the famous motto of foundation of theosophy, the Oracle at Delphi, actually has been interpreted as saying each man must know his other polarity, or recognize that polarity in himself. If he's male, he needs to recognize his feminine aspect, and vice versa, to become a fully integrated human being.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take another question. The third and the fourth races. Now, are you all familiar with the races? So we've got the rounds. So each round has 7 globes, and on each globe there are 7 root races. Okay, is that so? This question is about the third and the fourth root races on our globe. Had much higher civilizations than ours. Is this meant to be the case? Surely human evolution is meant to keep going upwards. So who'd like to answer?
Well, actually, you're right. Those early races had much more highly advanced civilizations, particularly the Atlantean. They reached much higher levels than we have now, in fact, and yet they brought on their own destruction through the misuse and abuse of their powers. They disturbed the harmony in nature and the earth, and they accelerated the end of their cycle, or so to speak, which was premature, and in the what's known as the flood or the deluge, which and the sinking of the final island of the Atlantean continent.
What about the human evolution is meant to keep going upwards?
I think in the long term, over millions of years, certainly that process goes on inevitably. But on the human level, we see, even in this epoch, we've seen civilizations come and go. They are born, they grow to a peak, and then they collapse, and then a new civilization is born from the roots or the seeds of the previous. But each civilization actually reaches a level higher than the previous one.
Yes.
Perhaps just a point. We need maybe to remind ourselves what was said about in the Bhagavad Gita, that there is periodically these Raja Rishis, these high masters of wisdom that incarnate from time to time to remind human beings of the truth. So, bearing this in mind, it's humanity has never been without a parent or parents or higher beings to help its evolution and to remind it of these truths, which are in addition, as was just said in the introduction, which are part of our inner spiritual nature when the human, the self-awakening, self-consciousness was there. It said that these, the innate ideas of justice, love, solidarity, devotion, and so on, were burnt into our plastic nature. So probably that's where we need to really stress the idea of progressive awakening. When we look at the cycles and civilizations, certainly there's the rise and fall, etc. But there is an impulse of reminding us that within humanity there is this these seeds of progress.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll have to go on to the next question. Now, the next one is actually very similar, but it extends the idea a little. It says, about cycles, how does it work? When one cycle ends, does everything go back to the same starting point? Or is it on a higher level like a spiral?
Yes, that's the key word, spiral. Everything is cyclic, but there would be no point in staying on the same level endlessly. That goes against nature, against evolution. Everything is evolving, let's say, upwards, up the spiral. So, but through the operation of the myriad cycles, of course, which is the fundamental law of nature, we could say, of connected with karma and reincarnation and so on. Although I believe it is possible to go back down that spiral under certain conditions. We can decelerate or slow down our evolution or retard it, we could say. If a soul is given, everyone is given.
Yeah, I think that answers the question. So now we've got one here, which is on the analogy of the lotus. You know, the lotus seed contains the complete pattern of the lotus in it before it becomes a plant. But can evolution continue if the conditions are not right? And whose responsibility is it?
Well, the conditions are not right is a hypothesis, working hypothesis. But we would say that nature offers, if we think of this whole elaborate pattern of the whole universe, the conditions are there, everything is provided for, but however, at a certain stage, man becomes self-conscious. Now, if we take a very simple analogy of what's happening today about climate change, about all the questions that people are thinking of, and scientists and politicians, economists, etc., are saying, but racking their brains about how to go about this, because there's too much fossil fuel, whatever, the pollution, this, that. It could be cyclic as well, but however, what mankind, there is a man-made contribution that has accelerated this level to a degree where he has to ask himself questions, because he has the intelligence of feeling that this has come to a level that if continued, then it'll become dangerous and self-destructive for humanity. So there is this capacity of seeing what's happening. This self-consciousness is intelligence and awareness. And this gives him sufficient impulse to ask himself questions, and he's asking himself the right questions, saying, how couldn't we avoid this? How can we also be more sustainable for the coming generation and have more respect for other kingdoms, etc., etc. So this was a mistake. However, the mistake, taken rightly, gives him the adequate questioning. And so conditions here are what he needs to just take up and go into the right direction.
Okay.
There's a biblical quote here that about the whole of nature is groaning in travail, awaiting the true sons of God to awaken, to arise, which is us. Nature wants us to evolve, to become true stewards of this creation and to act responsibly. So ultimately we are responsible, and the law of karma, it's a fundamental law of nature, the law of perfect justice always acts impersonally in that way.
Now, we've got a question here that goes right to the other scale of the cosmos. We've been talking about how we conduct ourselves. It's a question from Skype. Reference was made to 1 million other Earths. Am I right in thinking that the SD, the secret doctrine, postulates that these are separate and that they may not interact? That's a cosmological sort of a question.
Actually, the word I used was myriad, but it could be millions.
Myriad. Oh, you mentioned it.
Yeah, actually, yes, they are separate because, not least because of distance. I mean, it said that each planet has its own karma, its own field of evolution, so to speak, and which cannot be interfered with. It has its own planetary spirit, its own sphere of influence and powers. I mean, but as I said, the humanity is spread throughout the cosmos in one form or another, whether humanoid or otherwise, because the human stage is the midway point in evolution, midway between the lower and the higher kingdoms. So, and not least of all, why create, why emanate this vast cosmos or universe and put life, or in an intelligent life, on one tiny planet? It's not logical, is it? It's just, what's the point of?
Thank you. So let's finish with this last question about Hatha Yoga. What was the original purpose for the gurus of old to devise this system, the Hatha Yoga system that was mentioned, when yoga actually means union with God? And Hatha Yoga does not do this. So why did Hatha Yoga, what was the purpose of Hatha Yoga?
May I say something to that one? Or
Yeah?
Because the initiated knew when you awake the Kundalini that it is such a powerful energy and that you need a very strong body to withstand that. And the first preparation was to build up a strong, clean, healthy body to attempt higher stages of yoga.
Thank
And
you.
that was the meaning, actually.
I'm not sure, did you hear that on Skype? It's really it's proposed that Hatha Yoga was like a preliminary training in order to strengthen the physical vehicle.
Actually, one guru has stated that Hatha Yoga is really only a preparation for Raja Yoga, for the meditation, which is the real yoga. And also we could say that traditionally Hatha Yoga was only taught by a master. You know, it wasn't like today in the West where we have books on the subject and people can teach themselves. All these schools of yoga had their correspondent masters and gurus who make sure the chelas worked in the right way. And also it said Hatha Yoga is an extremely difficult path to follow, not suitable for everyone, and that even Judge says it's not really suitable for the West because of the stringent postures, or asanas as they call them, and particularly even the lotus position. We are not we're brought up with that from birth, as they are in India and other places.
Yeah, one question from the audience, then we have
just
a break.
comment on that. The answer that the Secret Doctrine gives is not quite that, as far as I'm aware. In Volume 1 of the Secret Doctrine, HPB says the masters entirely discountenance Hatha Yoga and say that it can never develop into Raja Yoga. That's just my opinion.
No, it cannot develop into Raja Yoga.
Well, I think that...
Yeah, we must be cautious, take everything in the context of what is written, probably, and see that, well, at least Theosophy stresses the development of spiritual wisdom first, and then the rest will follow. But so, everything falls into place from that.
Just a quick question. Why is it called a secret doctrine? Why don't you just call it a dossier?
A dossier.
A dossier.
Yes. It sounds a bit fishy to me for myself also.
Okay,
You have a point actually, because once you write a book on all these subjects, these topics, and publish it, then it's no longer secret, is it?
Yeah, but it was secret, you see, and it's progressively given out. For instance, at the beginning of the Piscean age, all the secret knowledge was withdrawn because it was a period in which it was foreseen or unlikely that the knowledge would be misused. But now it's being given out again.
But as was said, there's the method of learning which develops intuition. So from that point, it becomes a self-realization as something inside.
Instead of secret, we could use the word esoteric. Esoteric knowledge, as opposed to exoteric. The esoteric knowledge has always been around in one form or another, usually in secret schools or brotherhoods, the mystery schools and so on. It was preserved and not given out to the hoi polloi, but only to trusted initiates, because knowledge is power, and a lot of this knowledge in the wrong hands could be misused or misunderstood.
And it could not be named a dossier because it's not a personal opinion or a personal doctrine that is exposed.
It's something to be learned by all. That's why you use that tag.
Something to be learned.
Exactly.
Yeah, certainly, yes.
Or practicalized.
Or
Open to all.
Open to all.
But not all want it. Not all.
And the great prophets
okay,
gave knowledge to everybody. All the hoi polloi got the knowledge from the great prophets, if they would listen to them. So we can't just say that it's only for a certain section of people who can, assimilate it. Knowledge is for everybody, and the prophets have proved it.
Okay, I think we've got to...
This program gives the point of view.
I'm sorry,
Can't
Charles.
just say the Holy Spirit is the custodian of power, the custodian of knowledge. That the Holy Spirit is the custodian of knowledge. It's all and in all. rather than say secret doctrine. Nobody
Well,
has known it.
depends what you mean by the Holy
The
Spirit.
creator. Well, I'm just
The
from the
creator.
point of view, maybe the creator.
Well, in theosophy, we talk about the universal world soul, or the anima mundi. I mean, those are, you could correlate them to those ideas. So,
I just
friends,
wanted my point with this.
thanks very much. We're going to have a break. Then there'll be two more short talks. Science and Theosophy. That's the fifth talk. Science and Theosophy. And the sixth one will be the ethics of the secret doctrine. So we'll have a break. How long? We've run over time. Shall we have 15 minutes? Is that okay? And then we meet back at what time would that make it?
30?
Probably before we just go away for our break, it's worth reading what HPB has dedicated in the secret doctrine, and it's for each of us to just reconciliate, with the different viewpoints. This work is dedicated to all theosophists in every country and to every race, for they called it forth, and for them it was recorded.
Dear friends, there's an English-American writer called Thomas Paine, who influenced quite a bit the French Revolution, and he once said that there were two types of thought: those who proceed from reflection, rationalization, intellectualization, and those that bolt into the mind on their own accord. And this saying really kind of reveal a little bit about how we can get to truth or to pseudo-truth. And so this topic about the science, modern science, and the sacred doctrine, in reflecting on this topic, we have few questions or some questions that come into mind, and that is, what is the ultimate goal of science, and for what purpose does science investigate the what we call the state of matter and consciousness? What, for instance, the moral result of scientific discoveries and their practical application for modern humanity? Has science provided humanity with a knowledge that is a balanced way of development that include, for instance, the different aspects of human nature, the physical, the psychic, the mental, the spiritual? What's the viewpoint, what's the standing point of the sacred doctrine with regard to modern science? And can we claim that modern science is actually an exact science? Those are some of the questions that come into mind when we think about the topics. But first of all, we need to make this clear that the position of the sacred doctrine with regard to modern science is this: that that theosophy of the sacred doctrine accepts the fact presented by modern science whenever they agree or prove the truth of occultism. However, the sacred doctrine consider modern science as being materialistic and devoid of philanthropy. Now, we know that the sacred doctrine was written in part to challenge materialism in science, which causes modern science to deny the reality of spirit and soul, and the occult side of nature and man. Now, when we look at the teaching, the sacred doctrine, it says that the sacred doctrine is an accumulated wisdom of the ages. That is a knowledge recorded by generation after generation of seers, of adepts, whose gaze, according to the sacred doctrine, has penetrated the kernel of matter and recorded the soul in there. When an ordinary profane would otherwise only see the external work of forms. And this really translates how modern science is the method and the method of investigation and the theory and the conclusion of modern science compared to ancient teaching that is in the sacred doctrine. That is that modern science focuses far too much on the phenomenal world, the world of effect rather than the world of causes. We are told that the sacred doctrine is itself scientific essentially because it's based on some seed ideas which could help the modern science basically learn and come to the truth basically. And those seed ideas are that the system that the adept belongs to is based on the principle of an homogeneous substance principle, spirit and matter. And the second one is that the whole universe is only a differentiation or manifestation of that absolute unknown essence. But it's also said that the entire universe is an embodied consciousness, which means there's no dead matter, everything is life. That the universe is illusion, the manifested universe is illusion, in the sense that it's temporal and transient and always changing, but also that every impulse of evolution comes from within, without, as was said before in the talks. So those elements, those seed ideas will serve as a basis for modern scientists to learn from in order to move forward in coming to the truth that is being taught by the sacred doctrine. The other point that I wanted to mention is that the sacred doctrine was written as as an introduction to an understanding of the forces, the law of nature, the forces of nature. And what are those forces? The force of electricity, electromagnetism, the law of gravity, the law of cycle, periodicity, all those forces that are being investigated by modern science or explained in the sacred doctrine. And finally, that the sacred doctrine also had influence and continue to influence scientists and the scientific world of the 19th and 20th century. And because after the publication of Sacred Doctrine, there was a series of discovery, such as the discovery of the X-ray, of radioactivity, of the electron, with so many applications in terms of telecommunication, aviation, medicine, chemistry. In a nutshell, basically the modern science as it stands today cannot and resolve all the ills of the society, and basically lack what is fundamental in the philosophical teaching, which is altruism, which is philanthropy, which is ethics. So the next speaker will expand on that one. Thank you.
So friends, the question is ethics. Where does the ethics come from? What is the ethics of the secret doctrine? Because without moral code, then we have really little to base our conduct of life and our decisions on. Now, the secret doctrine, as a book, proposes that there does exist a transcendental and comprehensive ethical framework. That is a reality in nature. Ethics is not something invented by men or by individuals. And it's part of the ancient wisdom. And this ethical imperative arises from the metaphysical proposition that all beings are one, are united. We came from the same place. We're going to the same place. Our ultimate destiny is the same for all beings in the cosmos. And that provides us with a way of looking at life which begins to dissolve the ties or the illusion of separateness. And the illusion of separateness is the problem of the age. We have the amplification of the importance of the individual. We have the amplification of divisive religions, my religion and your religion, and they argue and fight each other. We need a universal basis for ethics. Now, it's said in the Secret Doctrine that ethics stem from philosophy and from the metaphysical conception of the unity that lies behind every manifestation. The Chinese call it the great extreme. I mean, the Brahmins, para-Brahm, the absolute, the eternal unmanifested reality that periodically manifests. That is what we are a part of. Every exoteric religion is, as Robert Crosby says, if I can find his quotation, the pale. He says all forms of religion are pale and distorted copies of the original statements upon which they are based. The three fundamental propositions that were outlined in the second talk are one way of looking at that. Religions are periodical, they come and go. They are designed at a certain time and place to suit a certain people. And as we read at the beginning of the chapter 4 of the Bhagavad Gita, they decay. We lose the mighty art. And that ethical decay we can see around us in the problems that we're having in civilization. But as was said previously, there's an optimism about the fact that if we understand the cycles, we know we're in a transition age, and a transition age is always bumpy because it involves a breaking down of the old hierarchical, concretized ideas that have become stale, that have become distorted, that have become built upon by those who had no right to change the great ideas that have always existed. People invent things, they think they're improving. So that is why you get this cyclic rise and fall of civilizations that was spoken about in the previous talks. So we live in a very scientific age. Now that's not a bad thing, but science alone, looking at physical life, the masters say that it has no ethical imperative. None of the laws of science tell us how to treat each other, how we should look after the elderly, the sick, how we should wisely restrain those who break the laws, who are the criminals. We have this dreadful inheritance from a punitive sort of Mosaic law of retributive justice. We put our prisoners in the worst possible condition to punish them, and we're surprised when they come out of prison that they don't come out better than they went in. They come out worse than they went in because of this misunderstanding of retribution as being a principle that's somehow authorized by God or some strange proposition. That's not part of the ancient wisdom. So science we can't rely on, though it's been very good. In the last 200 years, we've seen a great reduction in suffering of many people. We've seen improvements in hygiene, in housing, in medicine, in education, in government, in democracies. Those are all things on the physical plane, and they've benefited greatly what's called the golden 1 billion. But what about the other 6 billion? It's a terrible question. Now let me read you something from one of the Mahatmas. He's talking about the Theosophical movement. To achieve the proposed object, a greater, wiser, and especially a more benevolent intermingling of the high and the low. A more benevolent intermingling of the high and the low. The alpha and the omega of society was determined upon. So this is something we should do in this period of transition. We should try to break down the barriers between the rich and the privileged and the aristocracy, and those who are taken advantage of by the ones with power. And that was one of the objects of the Theosophical Society. And it's the great ideal of universal brotherhood. Universal meaning that we're not separated by our ideas, we're not separated by our religion, by our race, by our sex, by our beliefs or anything else. That we are a human family, and in the times that we're facing, which may be difficult, and they may get more difficult, We have to face them bravely because that's our karma. What we have sown, we have to reap. We have to do that in a way, and the only way, it seems, is to do it cooperatively, to do it without blame, and to unite people into a body. And that was part of the object of the Theosophical movement, was to start a nucleus. And a nucleus doesn't mean we all have to be united all in one go. It's not going to happen. Each Theosophical group can form a nucleus, and that is a nucleus of something which the future will build on. And it's a beautiful idea, and it's a very difficult idea, because until we disenthrall ourselves collectively and individually from the prejudices, the preconceptions, the ambitions, the personal likes and dislikes, those are the ethics of the SD. We have to go beyond those. The best way of working, of coming together in groups like this, of whatever theosophical stripe, is to work impersonally, is to work fraternally, unselfishly, and with the greatest tolerance. Because we're all coming from very different places, and we need to be tolerant of other people's little sort of biases and personal idiosyncrasies and all those other things. So it's not easy, the ethics of the secret doctrine, and it's the same as the ethics of Raja Yoga. But if people of goodwill and patience and charity come together, then there's nothing that can't be achieved. So that, I think, is probably all that we really wanted to say. And just to sum up, really, is that wisdom that underpins all of the great ideas, all of the great philosophies of humanity, was an accumulated effort by, as we heard in one of the talks, countless generations of wise men. And that accumulation of wisdom is never lost. Even with terrible cataclysms and problems that, for instance, we heard about the Atlanteans went through. And we were the Atlanteans, by the way. I mean, we were part of that process of messing up and getting it wrong and hopefully learning. Even with all that, there's that wisdom is never lost. There are always, humanity always has elder brothers who are looking over its shoulder, helping it, if it will only be helped, if we will learn the lessons of the past, if we will apply the disciplines that are given in the ancient wisdom, and most of the religions have those disciplines. So it's up to us to do the work. One of the questions before was asked, who is responsible? We are all collectively responsible. If we work together, we help each other, we overcome our personal differences, then there's nothing simpler. We don't have to do too much. We don't have to strain and do just the simple things, and do the simple things right. And the philosophy teaches us that the law of karma will look after all the results. We don't have to worry too much about the results. So that concludes the last talk this evening. So rather than having the breakout groups again, which we had previously, we'll have the two speakers and a moderator, and we'll take your questions directly from the audience. If you just raise your hand, or on Skype if you'd like to just add your questions to the chat box.
There's quite a lot of leftover written questions.
Yeah, and we can take questions that you ask that you particularly like answering. So, who's moderating this one? You're moderating.
I'm Bruce.
Yeah. Sorry.
Somebody stop here.
Quite a lot of hands that take your question.
I want to ask, like, if we are all related to each other and we are all one, and I don't mean only like us, like people, but also animals, and so what would be the guideline or about nutrition? Like, I mean, if I wouldn't eat another person, why would I eat an animal, or why would I eat a plant? So it's not like really like vegetarian, because you are eating plants, and plants also are as alive as I am.
Yes, that's an interesting question.
Good question.
We're not all going to be angels overnight. So we have to start where we are. Some people need to eat meat, and that's part of the sacrifice of the animal kingdom.
So is that also is connected to like the energy is transformed. So
Yes.
it's whether it's a plant, it's an animal, is when you consume that energy, you transform into something else.
That's If someone else want to comment on that?
I think there's something, a text from the Mahatma's letter that talk about how a bird that is eaten, I can't remember exactly the phrase.
Is it about a bird eating the butterfly or something?
Yes, that kind of thing. Which you see, I'm not sure if it's what I'm going to say is correct, but I think life has, things will constantly be recycled back into nature. So, the impression that we give to something will obviously affect that things, the evolution of that things. So that's how I see it basically. But in terms of nutrition, I think this is the process, the natural process that is in place for us. I mean, some people, it's recommended to eat, to be vegetarian, but because of it's healthier and has more psychic and benefit and stuff. But it's a difficult question really to answer.
Something to
Yes, please.
Okay. There's a different consciousness between animals and plants. So, also from the benefit of eating them, with plants, you're inflicting as little as possible of harm or hurt to that organism. With an animal, it's a higher consciousness, and definitely very much inflicting a lot of harm, and also preventing them completing their own evolution.
Okay. Is that a comment?
Something
Yes.
to the vegetarian
Yes.
stuff. Of course, we don't need animals to eat, but the
Could you
plants.
speak up, Petra, for the ones on Skype? A bit louder?
Yeah, we don't need animals to eat, but it says in the secret doctrine that the plants need the human body to develop further. So, if the plants are not eaten, they are rotting away and become humus again. So it's an endless cycle, but if they are in our body, they have to grow the heart, the liver, the blood, they reach a higher level of consciousness.
Thank you. Here's a written question from earlier. I do not concur that man is absolute. It could be said that God is the absolute. In other words, he is all and in all, according to Ephesians 4, verse 2 to 6. Are we the architect of our destiny? In the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. John 1, verse 1 to 3. So in other words, this question is saying God is the absolute, man isn't. Can anything be said?
Man and God are, in one sense, the same. You see, if you go to the metaphysics of cosmology, which we had in the first talk, and anthropology in the second talk, the doctrine of emanations is another way of calling it, is that man is an emanation from the divinity. I mean, in theosophy, there's not a concept of an anthropomorphic God. And the hierarchies that were mentioned are ladders, if you like, on that plane of outbreathing that is a successive planes of emanations that become more and more polarized, more and more material, until we reach, we've got this stuff, the hard stuff. I mean, that's the most differentiated you can get. But the planes above that ultimately lead man who has that the divinity within him to merge back into it's the one source.
And Theosophy uses philosophical terminology in a very precise way. So, absolute. If we say that the deity is literally absolute and infinite and omnipresent, as Christianity says, then that means everything else, man included, has to be that one absolute, infinite, omnipresent. Because omnipresence means absolutely present everywhere, infinitely, which means even an atom of this paper is as much in essence the divine as the divine. Did you want to?
Yeah, that's really the core idea about deity, but also when we talk about God, we're not referring to that and those impersonal working and intelligence forces in nature. The idea about God is, as Will says, is not anthropomorphized at all in the theosophical teaching, and this is the main difference between the theosophical teaching and theology.
May I just rephrase it? Could I use the word Father as in the creator of heaven and earth, the controller and the controller of the heaven and the earth?
You can. You did. But
because God in itself, it was derived from the word good, in the English word good.
Well, the Theosophy says the word God isn't related to the word good. It's derived from the Hebrew word yod.
It is very semantic, actually. It is terminological inexactitude. It's meaningless. The only word that's being used is Father, the creator of the heaven and the earth, the ruler.
Well, that's anthropomorphic in a sense. You're saying that this being is a male or a father.
It's all and in all.
Okay, well, let's take some other questions. Chris?
We were talking about the age of Pisces and the transition period to the age of Aquarius. So is astrology then, would you say, is a branch of metaphysics?
Is astrology a branch of metaphysics? Yes, it is. Astrology has always been anciently taught. With astronomy, which is one and the same in the old days. And it's said that actually the real, true astronomy, astrology, it only comes at the last initiation. It's a very, very high, advanced science.
You say that's reserved for the third and fourth volumes. Spoke about earlier.
I wouldn't describe the third and the fourth volumes as being something that will give you the final initiation. But there is a basis in astrology, and it's a great science. I'm not sure we have a very reliable astrologer. I'm not an astrologer, but would someone like to say anything else on that?
Well, yes. astrology is definitely part of the occult teaching, and because one is that it deals with the law of periodicity, which is a very interesting law to understand about man and nature. So,
any more questions? Novice?
I'm wondering if I could just inquire about the connection between science and ethics, that's scientists and ethics. Because I think today it's quite fashionable to deride science and scientists and say that they have no ethics, But it is a job of a scientist to make a scientific inquiry and to find the truth, whether in any formula that he's trying to discover for the benefit of mankind. And of course you can say that in his own personal capacity, he would have some ethics, All scientists are not butchers, they're not killers, they're actually doing something for mankind to improve our lives. And today we would be sitting in this room very comfortable with heating and going out, and having all the amenities that make our own life more comfortable, where we have better health and, so many advantages we get because of scientists who have worked very hard, put their own lives at risk to give us what we have today.
No,
what's the question?
I understand that.
What's the question?
I didn't want to suggest that, and perhaps I should have phrased it differently. I didn't want to suggest that scientists are unethical and unprincipled. Some of them certainly are. We've got all sorts of misuses of science. But many of them, as you say, are self-sacrificing. They're working very hard to try to benefit people. But I think the point that I was hoping to make was that science doesn't of itself, if it looks at the objective universe, inform itself ethically. Ethics have a metaphysical basis, not a physical one. You see, if we... The great problem with modern science is that there's been what they call moral relativism. And moral relativism comes from not having a philosophy behind you. You make up your mind based on the best observations that you can make. And that leads to the doctrine of utilitarianism. I don't know if you're familiar with utilitarianism. It's a sort of a moral relativistic position where you don't really have any fixed principles, but you just sort of muddle through in the best way you can. And it's what we've been doing in most of the 20th century, and it leads to all sorts of problems like the law of unintended consequences. We think this is a great idea, we're going to have this enormous industrial complex, we're going to take all the minerals out of the earth and we're going to do these things that are good for our physical well-being, but there's lots of unintended consequences because they haven't really got a deep philosophical understanding. So...
But that's what Gandhi always said, that if you want to go for science, but you must also have some mastery over the spiritual idea. Because otherwise you will become a slave of science, you'll abuse science. Yes. It's a double-edged sword. Every invention, every scientific is a double-edged sword. It depends how you use it. But if you have the tools, the spiritual tools, then you will use it properly. Otherwise you will abuse it and you'll end up, with bad consequences. But it's not the fault of the scientists, per se.
Thank you. Did you want to? There are three short...
There's a question.
Sorry?
It's only just a question, but that can be done afterwards. Can we say anything about the method of study of the secret doctrine? Because I don't think we've touched on that, only very briefly. But what is anything recommended?
You want to say something?
Do you want to say something?
No.
you understand?
Well, a number of methods of study, and yes, perhaps we should have mentioned this before. One of them that we're doing on Wednesday was proposed by John Garrigue, and John was a student of Robert Crosby, whose photo is up there. And we're working our way through that. It's sort of a sequential. It's not a reading from the beginning to the end. It's a selection from the introductory, from the summing up. It's on the back of the Wednesday leaflet, if you want to have a look at it. And it seeks to really introduce the ideas like the three fundamentals, some of the core ideas in a sort of a coherent and a logical series of steps, which is an easier way of reading the Secret Doctrine than just beginning on page 1.
There are 3 short written questions from earlier that we can combine perhaps into one question. It was mentioned about the Trans-Himalayan Brotherhood in or near Tibet. Do they have a physical location and presence there, or is it purely spiritual? And is anyone alive today in contact with these same masters? Are any theosophical members in communication with the masters? Do you want to?
I think the fraternity of the masters have always existed since man has been man, really. So whether we know of public communication with them or not, they are still there and communicating with those who feed themselves to be able to have such communication, or within their own community, within their own fraternity. As whether they exist physically, they do exist physically, in flesh like us, and physical location, I have no idea. But
they've. Many of you probably know that if you go to the British Library here in London, you can see hundreds of physical paper letters with handwriting on, which were the Master's own letters, mainly to A.P. Sinnett, who was mentioned in the first talk. And they say in their letters, they are not disembodied beings floating around, they're physically incarnated here on this planet. They have physical homes, physical locations. The Trans-Himalayan region used to be known as Little Tibet. It's not actually Tibet itself, but the areas of Ladakh, Lahaul, Spiti, and so on, near Kashmir, northern India. And that, we're given to understand, is where the main base of the Trans-Himalayan Brotherhood is. But they also said that they're not interested in coming in contact with all and sundry. As was just said, the few who fit themselves for that contact and who have committed themselves wholeheartedly to unselfish service for humanity and to study these teachings that we've been talking about, to assimilate the teachings, practice them, promulgate them. Only those members of the Theosophical movement are ones who stand any chance of hearing from the Masters. But even if we don't hear from the Masters, that's still, we understand from their writings what our task and duty is. And Lao Tzu, who's Tao Te King, who we study in the first part of the Wednesday meetings, famously said, those who say don't know, those who know don't say. So it's often said, if you find someone saying, I know the Masters, I'm in contact with the Masters, or the Masters have been communicating with me, most probably it's not true. You may have been communicating with psychic delusions or astral something or other. But there probably are people in today's Theosophical movement in some type of contact with the Masters, even if they may not be aware of it in their waking consciousness. But those who may be consciously aware of it will not publicly broadcast it or mention it to others. Is there one last question from the floor? Yes.
We've evolved over many thousands of years, and we're now in the Aquarian age, and we've got the United Nations and all sorts of organisations, and we've got the Angels of Light. why then is it such a dark happening with what we have, the IS and Ebola, and everything you read is murder, mayhem, decapitation, God knows what else. Why is the good side not bringing us some peak of joy and happiness and putting down that megalomaniacs and psychopaths that seem to want to run the place?
Well, just for clarification, when you say we've got the angels of light, what do you mean exactly?
I said with the angels of light, yes.
I wasn't sure what you meant by that.
Well, with the influence of the Brahman, if you like, that creative being force throughout nature and the universe, and those messengers of the divine outside of us, and those who've gone before us are still. Why is there not more goodness, joy, and peace as we learn to believe?
I think this is we all aspire for.
Can you repeat the question? Okay, so just to briefly recap the question that's been asked, it is why, with all this higher input into mankind's evolution and the presence of hierarchies of Dhyan Chohans and so on that were mentioned, and man being divine in his essence, why are there so many bad things still going on in the world? The terrorism, the diseases. Why is this allowed to happen? Why isn't there something done to make things better?
I think this is a question probably can be put forward to the Christian, really. I mean, they're the one who pray to God for help and for things to change suddenly and fortnightly. So, but from a theosophical point of view, it's been said clearly that it's only and the Master actually said that very strongly in the Mahatma's letter, that all the evil that we face in the society is only man's made, and unless a man has changed his behavior through correct knowledge and correct understanding of the law that works in the universe, which is the law of universal brotherhood, the law of unity, the law of fraternity and solidarity, and develop and rid himself of selfish motives, there will always be strife in the society, in our society, both personal and collective. So, and secondly, that the theosophical teaching say that we as human beings, through self-devised and through self-induced effort, have to change all these ills from happening. And it's not any hierarchy of angels or that was going to do that for us. Because in the process of evolution, which is a continuum, each has to do their duty. And, you don't expect other people to do the duty for yourself. So basically, this is what it is.
Where does temptation come from? Because we've got to deal with it all the time, all temptations.
It's whatever your heart is set upon, that's where the temptation comes from.
Very difficult, temptations.
But there's one other aspect to the question, which is that we shouldn't worry too much about what other people do. Other people do what they want to do. What we have to do is, if we really want to reform ourselves and to try and help other people, is worry about ourselves and apply the teachings to ourselves as best we can. And if other people go do crazy stuff, that's up to them. And there will be plenty of that, because karma makes sure that we have to learn. But we just we have to take the rough with the smooth. But the main thing is to not be too concerned what other people do, is to discipline ourselves and be as good as we can and forgiving as we can, and cooperate with others.
Excuse me, can you just stress on the wisdom of karma, which is given in the Secret Doctrine? What you just said is for us to learn. How does karma, which is also intelligent, work to teach us exactly what you're saying?
Karma is a wonderful subject. I mean, if you really want to do some good reading, read about karma.
Yeah. The answer to the question can probably be summed up in the one word karma. That man has freedom of choice to act in certain ways, and the law of action-reaction means consequences and the corresponding effects will come. The fact that human beings have been setting negative, violent, harmful causes amongst the good ones in motion for many years means there has to be a correlative effect to balance it out and equilibrize it. And so everywhere, whatever we see, whatever we look at, whatever we do, it's karma. Whatever is karma, says HPB.
But I think it's interesting to see the wisdom part. It's not just action reaction, but there's something as a consequence. But the idea of wisdom and what it awakens in human beings.
Yeah, I mean Crosby and Judge are very, very good on this. You see, if you're in a bad situation, you've got terrible distress either in yourself or in your family, and this has become quite widely accepted now in sort of pop psychology. It's about positive thinking. It's about the way you approach those challenges that are brought to you. Now, if we have the idea that it's all misery and that we don't deserve it and it's someone else's fault, we're never going to learn a thing. But if we take the other view, that we are collectively responsible, that we have something to learn from every, even the smallest event in your life. Everything, if you're a real occultist, everything holds a message for you. I mean, if you trip over a pebble, it's even a little message in that. If you smash a plate, or you do something silly, there's something in there, even in the most trivial things. And if we take the attitude that, when we do get put upon by bad circumstances, that we're going to look inside ourselves and to try to find out what we should be learning, then very quickly we'll come to a better place. And that's karma is an extraordinary insight into the way nature works.
In the interest of time, we have to move on now to the final part, which is some closing words from the platform.
Thank you. Well, I think that last panel summed up really everything that we needed to say in the last two talks, the fifth and the sixth talk. Now, the first talk, I'll just give one or two ideas, was about the writing and the history of the secret doctrine. And something that really attracted my attention, I'm not sure about yours, was that the secret doctrine was certified by the masters. It wasn't a bit of a mishap that sort of came together and like most books do, so someone's inspiration. I mean, it was carefully planned, and they certified it. They put their name behind it, and I thought that was very interesting. And also, HPB said that it was all that could be given out for the next few centuries. So for another 100 years, we may not get a great deal more because there's so much in it. The second talk was that these fundamental realities are for us to reflect on. We should study them, reflect on them, meditate on them. And if we do that, then life begins to look very, very different. We lose all that personal anxiety about, this little me, I, myself. And you free the mind. I mean, you become closer to your soul nature. Because all this difficulty that we're surrounded with on the objective plane of being is pretty illusory. if we look inside ourselves, those of what we are, because we are a reflection of the deity, and that, as was said, that information is imprinted in us. This is what we really are inside. So, and then the other thing the second talk said was that we should really check it with common sense. Everything we do should be checked with common sense, whether it agrees with our experience. And as was said on the panel about psychic delusion, a lot of the problems of the Theosophical movement, and the New Age, by the way, are from people who are not qualified occultists going in and going on psychic explorations and getting channeling from all sorts of beings. I mean, that's played havoc, frankly, with the teachings. So the third talk was about the birth of the cosmos. And one of the ideas was that the hierarchies, these great hierarchies of perfected beings, carry the plans of the universal mind. They carry the plans of the universal mind. It's a wonderful idea. So this perfection that is part of the Absolute is carried and transmitted through these hierarchies. And each one has their own responsibility, it was said. And there's a ladder of perfection. And that gives us optimism. And the fourth talk was about the fact that man follows the cosmos. The construction of the cosmos and the construction of man are one and the same thing. That he is a reflection of the whole. I mean, you can see that in the way an electron circles a nucleus, in the way that the atom forms a part of the cell, and the cell is a part of the man. Man is a part of the earth, and the earth is... I mean, it's one unbelievable chain. And it's all interrelated. The plan of the cosmos is really the plan of the perfect man. Because nature, nothing is lost in nature. All those periods of evolution going back forever are not lost. All that perfection is never lost. And we do our best to embody it within ourselves, in our societies, in our families, in our communities. So that's the summing up of the first four talks, and then we had enough of a summing up, I think, for the panel. So we'll bring the meeting to an end. So thank you very much for your collaboration together in your groups and for formulating excellent questions.